When they are sworn in next year, Republicans will owe their narrow House majority in no small part to the 4 congressional seats they managed to flip in the state of New York. One of those seats was won by newcomer George Santos, who was apparently just caught red-handed by the New York Times fabricating key parts of his biography. And now the incoming congressman, is breaking his silence, telling various news outlets that, well, yeah, he didn't graduate from the colleges he claimed to have degrees from. In fact, hasn't graduated from college at all. That he didn't work for top-flight finance firms Goldman Sachs and Citigroup as he had claimed. And when a Jewish newspaper cast down on his campaign website its claim that his grandparents fled Jewish persecution in Ukraine during World War II, George Santos told the New York Post, quote, "I never claimed to be Jewish. I am Catholic. Because I learned my maternal family had a Jewish background, I said I was Jewish."
Did I embellish my resume? Yes, I did. And I'm sorry. And it shouldn't be done. And there's words can't express 100% how I feel. But I'm still the same guy. I'm not a fraud. I'm not a cartoon character. I'm not some mythical creature that was invented.
Now, there's still a lot that we don't know, the unaccounted for question of how exactly George Santos went from being a deadbeat tenant just 5 years ago, as he admitted to the Post, and earning $55,000 2 years ago, to then suddenly lending his campaign $700,000 this year. Santos has not responded to NBC News' request for comment. Joining us is one of the New York Times reporters who broke the story of Santos and his falsified biography, Grace Ashford, and Mark Gisano, who's a columnist and member of the editorial board at Newsday, who crucially has been writing about the questions and controversies surrounding Santos since all the way back in his first congressional run in 2020. Grace, let me start with you, just because when you and your co-authors in the New York Times published this piece, you didn't get a response from the incoming freshman congressman. Usually there would be some receipts provided. He didn't. He instead issued a statement saying, the New York Times out to get me. What do you consider now confirmed, given what he has said subsequent to publication of the story?
Well, thanks so much for having me, Chris. We reached out to the congressman-elect, I guess a little over a week ago now, a few days before we were planning to publish, really just seeking, clarity and hoping he could help us, address some of the inconsistencies that we were seeing, inconsistencies that he has now admitted to, specifically, as you noted in your introduction, Goldman Sachs and Citigroup, which he was pretty clear that he had worked for. He gave his position, that he worked a couple of positions at Citigroup, but they didn't have any record of him when we reached out to them, as well as his education. When we reached out to Baruch College and as well at NYU, which is another place that he had told some people that he had obtained degrees. They had no record of him either. So we sought, just clarification. We sought records that would help us to, substantiate these claims. Unfortunately, he did not provide them to us. And now I guess we can see that those in fact were not true claims.
Yeah, I should note about those four things that were on his, that he claimed, which is Goldman Sachs, worked for Citigroup, worked for Goldman Sachs, NYU, Baruch College. Those are sort of, you can establish definitively, right, whether a person went to a school or not, whether they worked at a place or not. And, pretty clearly, definitively, he has now admitted that. But there's still a whole bunch of other stuff, Mark, that is unresolved. And before getting to that, I want to just get your perspective. When this great story in the Times came out, people were like, oh, my gosh, how did it get there? And then people started pointing to your work, raising questions about a lot of inconsistencies in his story. How do you answer this question of how did it get to this point? This guy gets elected to Congress, and then this story comes out making it look like he might have made up like enormous parts of his entire biography.
Well, it's a great story. And I think the takeaway from it is that it's important to do this kind of local beat level reporting, asking these kind of basic questions all the time. It's interesting that he, hasn't been very clear about where he lives, even perhaps the most basic question of all. He continues to be somewhat evasive about that. I think it's unfortunate that it took so long for this to get to the national level, but unsurprising because a lot of local and smaller outlets who are doing a lot of good work on this, the North Shore Leader is another one, are stretched very thin and are covering a lot of things at once, including local government and a lot of campaigns at once. So that's one problem. And then the second issue, I think, is that there's this sort of disconnect between the local and national media, where our big sort of national political conversations are about just national issues, and things don't float up as much as they used to, maybe from the local level.
So there's a few outstanding questions I wanted just to get into, and Grace, let me start with this. One of the things. There appears to be the possibility that he was accused of a crime in Brazil, essentially a check-kiting crime, that his mom had worked for an elderly man, that someone had taken that man's checkbook and written checks, and that possibly he fled the country. I couldn't quite figure out like what was being said, and I know you were being very careful about what you couldn't say, but like that's still unresolved. Yeah, we didn't get anything on that, right?
That is a kind of a key thing. Actually, Mr. Santos denied that this had happened. He says that he's not a criminal. He said he's, not a criminal in any jurisdiction. He did not explain how these, Brazilian court records have his name and his date of birth, his parents' names. He didn't sort of address that. And in fact, when you look at the court records, they sort of tell the story of him. He's a young man living with his mother, seemingly at the time. And yes, she had the checkbook of a former man that she'd been caring for, who had since passed on. And George actually confessed, according to the police records, of taking the checkbook and writing some checks, which resulted in police action. The sort of part of the confusing thing, I think, is that the case was it's unresolved because when the time came for the prosecutors to continue with the case, they couldn't find him, and so they actually sent someone to his house. He was no longer there, and they weren't able to find him. So the case is, according to prosecutors as of last week, still open.
Okay, that brings us to the $700,000 question mark, which to me is the big unanswered one. This is an individual who various parts of the publicly available records show has not been a person of great wealth, hasn't had a lot of money. He was evicted. He was making, sort of normal middle class income. Suddenly he has a company that pays him $700,000 a year. He loans himself a campaign. Do we know where this money came from and how it is the case that he suddenly went from making $55,000 a year to $700,000 a year? Do we know the answer to that question mark?
There's still a lot of questions about that, mostly about this organization, the Devalder organization, which paid much of that money. And I think that that's the big question that a lot of people, including myself, and I'm sure Grace and lots of others, are scratching at now, is where that money came from. And I think it's important because that is what gets you into more trouble in terms of investigations and issues with the law than just kind of minor issues with your bio. I think it's interesting, for example, that Nick LaLota, who is the neighboring incoming Republican congressman to the east, is now calling for or suggesting that there should be an investigation, even law enforcement, if it comes to that. So that gets you in trouble if you have financial problems.
Yeah, and obviously there's a whole bunch of federal disclosures that are necessitated by the FEC when he talks about loaning the money. We should, and you just know that the fellow incoming freshman, Nick LaLota from Bayshore, has said that there should be a congressional ethics investigation and law enforcement if necessary, as well as Nassau County Executive Bruce Blakeman. So that may put him a little bit more hot water. But I think a lot of people are going to keep pulling on that thread, including Grace Ashford and Mark Chisano, my guest tonight. Thank you both. Really appreciate it.